Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my channel, where I like to make audiobooks of various web novels. In this series, we'll be focusing on The Forgotten Dungeon from Royal Road, and in this video, we'll be doing chapters 31 to 35. I hope that you enjoy. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 31. Charles Blue Flame. Of course, I couldn't sleep for the whole 12 hours. And of course, there were matters that required my attention. Of course, there were documents to sign and people to direct. I almost wished that my time with Agnes wouldn't come to an end. Peasants out here needed somebody to take control. Otherwise, they would just be running around like headless chickens. I was getting comfortable in my chair, drinking my tea, and getting used to the work as an order representative. The authority to the order the servants around really came in handy at a time like this. Adam was sent away to start cutting down the silver trees around the campsite, and the rat's ambush rate had fallen by only 2 or 3 instances in a single day. And a few peasants died, but more came with each caravan, so it wasn't a big deal. It was then that my accursed fiancé waltzed into the freshly built office and dragged my sorry ass out again, and I squinted at the light, lamenting my fate. "We're here at last. Let's check up in the dungeon, Charles," she said with the smile again. "We don't have a scout, so I asked one of the bronze adventurers for help. Since bronze was the maximum denomination for the unaffiliated common people, it seemed that this help of hers wasn't completely incompetent. By the way, both me and Agnes were classified as gold-class adventurers. With the nobility came power, or the other way around. Not that it mattered. I have things to do, I was cut off yet again by her face staring at mine, uncomfortably close. I was forced to swallow my words. "Agnes." "Do you? I reckon this circus you call a colony will run itself." "No, you don't understand. They need direction. My direction." I protested heavily, still being dragged towards the adventurers' camp. "And I think that you're forgetting something, sweetie." "Huh?" "The druid guy, you know, that tall, broody one. I reckon you promised to search for his companions in the dungeon," the princess asked while she was chuckling like it wasn't her problem. Well, it wasn't, but... Oh, crap, you're right. I completely forgot about it. Wait a moment, how do you know about that deal? I countered with trying to wiggle out of her iron grip. It didn't work. I have my sources. "The spy master, huh?" A wide smile was only the answer. It looked cute and all, but I admit I was inwardly crying. I gained another level, which was not a small thing, since gaining experience was always getting harder. But the tempo at which Agnes was rushing forward left me dead tired and craving luxuries. I was not a wimp. It was just that a man in my station expected a certain level of amenities to be available. I had to keep enough time to lament before we arrived at the Swords and Hope camp. Boulder, even Lone Mountain, was sitting around the fire, preparing meat. Peter hung out in the back, taking out the meat cutlery and the help of the girl that seemed to be a bit familiar. Seeing his curiosity, Agnes stopped and pointed towards her. "That's Tina, a 4th-level rogue. She'll be coming with us." "Is that the best that the adventurers have available?" I asked, not caring if the person in question heard me. The peasants' opinions didn't matter, after all. Yes, still, she's experienced enough with her sensing abilities and are much better than any of our muscleheads or arcade wielders. The princess motioned in the direction of her party, and I inwardly agreed. None of them was cautious rogue type. Maybe, barring Peter. "It's an obvious oversight. Why haven't you filled that role already?" I asked suspiciously. "We had a rogue with us. He died helping us escape from one of the ambushes." The smaller tear appeared in her eye, only to be squashed immediately. "He will be remembered, and those bastards will pay." Her last words turned into a growl, and she stomped ahead, grabbing a piece of meat and devouring it greedily. "You just had to ask, sir." A calm voice came from the darkness. "Peter?" "We had a run-in the Fallen Forces a few months ago. They took us by surprise after we conquered one of the boundary dungeons." He sat down near me, cleaning off the metal surface of the pot with a brush. "We were hurt, tired. They had an advantage in numbers and superior position. Our porters and escorts were decimated. A massacre, and I can't describe it in any other way." The anger I heard in his voice was not about the loss of life. No, it was something more. Something personal, considering that Agnes told me that he was a spy master. "You frecked up," I stated. "Yes, I frecked up hard, sir," he added after a period of deliberation, "and we paid the price. But it won't happen again, as long as I breathe. There was a darkness here, one even I dared not to thread. So, who's the new girl? I asked to simply change the topic. Her name is Tina, like you've heard, sir. I'm surprised that you don't recognize her. Why would I? All the peasants looked the same to me. She was with you from the beginning, fought the rats too, so that's why she looked familiar. I see, still, only a 4th level. Disappointing. We commoners have it hard, sir, Peter answered with a bitter tone, nearly undetectable in his voice. Nearly. She's the highest level scout class available at the campsite, and her skills should be adequate for the 1st and even 2nd level of an ordinary dungeon, sir. Do you believe it to be an ordinary dungeon, Peter? I asked the obvious question. No, I do not, sir. He turned his head, observing the faraway flames from the moment. The princess is calling, we should go. I also turned my head towards the group and noticed that pretty much everyone was ready. Boulder and Lone Mountain had their armor and helmets on, weapons at the ready. Mages carried their staffs with small crystals fitted on the end, helping the mana conductivity. My superior class, the Ifrit magician, didn't need for such crunches. My body was my weapon. Agnes took a quick look around the surroundings and started talking. As you all know, we'll be the first team to truly delve into this dungeon. We had scouts check out the first room, but other than that is a complete mystery. She turned her attention to Peter. What do we know? The man in question bowed slightly before answering. This said that it bears resemblance to the ancient kingdom architecture. It may be even older. As such, I suspected it was assimilated by the dungeon on its way to the surface. His calm and flat tone made me sleepy, but I persevered. Coincidentally, this location has historical importance. He paused for effect. Oh, for God's sake, just speak up, Boulder bellowed, ruining his ambience. The spy master continued his speech, only a bit disgruntled. As you wish, he sighed. These ruins? What ruins? These ruins, Peter shouted with annoyance, pointing at the ground. The ruins that we're standing on right now. He recollected himself, his tone stabilizing. They were once part of the Henrik Walzer castle. The immortal Blade Master asked Lone Mountain with a strange emotion. Yes, the same one who was hailed as the strongest sword of the old empire. The Meiji Tech Empire? Boulder asked foolishly. No, Peter face-palmed. A short history lesson. These lands were once considered a part of the empire, a human nation battling the corruption to the north. This was 2 times as big as the current Gaynard Kingdom lands. To tell the truth, they often battled with our forces and the neighbors of the Dwarven meritocracy. Boring. Give me a minute. Both of these nations are now defunct, completely destroyed by the corruption. The survivors fleeing to our and the Dwarven Hold's territories. Anyway, these lands were said to be lost to humanity, and yet now we're standing above the castle dungeons. More importantly, down there may we encounter artifacts of the past era, replicated by the dungeon. Oh, more loot is good. Cut it, you barbarian. Peter was getting really salty over Boulder's constant interruptions. Anyways, the first room seems like it's excavated by the dungeon and used as a safe room. As usual, it is a large construction with solid walls and strange sources of light hanging from the ceiling. The floor is covered in sand, so we need to watch our footing. Anything else? Asked Agnes. I prepared the torches and everybody has their weapons ready. Charles, sir, do you need time to prepare? I shook my head in denial. While it was true that my duties were mostly administrative, I didn't forget that we were in the middle of hostile territory. I was clad in heavy leather armor and wore light boots and hardened soles. The order customary helmet adorned my head, complete with a sole artifact in my possession, a small necklace of fiery ruby. It had an ability to amplify magical fire. It was also, as to my shame, a gift from my fiancée, a fact that she didn't allow me to forget all my life. Then we're ready, let's move. With an order from Agnes, we moved towards the dungeon proper. The entrance was already strange. The oval hole in the ground looked like somebody carbonized the earth, creating lava-like growth around it. As the fire mage, I was all too familiar with the power capable of such destruction, and yet to have the dungeon which could summon them to its infancy made me uneasy. We descended slowly, with Tina as our scout, Boulder and Agnes walking just behind her. Me, Eve, and Peter were in the middle, while Lone Mountain was guarding our backs. It took us a minute to enter the first room, and suddenly I understood why Peter was so excited. A few silvery chandeliers were hanging from the ceiling. They emanated a strange, cool light, unlike anything that I'd seen before. Truly artifacts of the immortal Blade Master, probably priceless too. My party, however, kept their eyes on the ground level. Not breaking the formation, we advanced with full concentration. Soon a black hole opened up in the wall, a shift from the bricks into carved rock. The rogue stopped, tilting her head. "What did you see, Tina?" asked Agnes with a strained voice. It was good to hear that I wasn't the only one to feel tense. "There are strange marks on the floor, my lady," the little scout answered, tossing her braids. "It's like somebody was dragging mighty heavy weapon on the floor. See this groove? There are 4 of them, perfectly made. What kind of animal or monster could do such a thing?" She trembled, her childish face scrunched up in anxiety. "That can't be all. Yes, there is this, a constant noise. Iron striking the rock." Tina gulped nervously. "And it's getting closer, my lady." "Damn," Bolden mumbled under his nose, his tower shield and mace barely fitting into the tunnel. We moved forward. Lone Mountain changed position with Boulder. "You have a greater reach and mobility when it comes to fighting," Agnes ordered while her head swiveled around, searching for prey. "Let's move. I would prefer less cramped surroundings." Tunnels were a mess of intersecting roads and dead ends. As we advanced, the bare rock was slowly covered by lichen and vines. The air grew drier and staler, and longer we walked. Somehow, we nearly managed to find an exit, just before the boss monster found us instead. At first, we only heard what Tina described, a noise, and with time it grew loud that even our ears noticed it. Then it came, a strange amalgamation of metal and death, and it looked like a mad mage decided that use his axes needed to move on their own, and he granted them life, and the 4 halberd-like appendages were used as a crutch to haul its obese main, fleshy body. Countless tentacles extended from the middle of its mass, seemingly fused with the surrounding metal. 2 more small blades were sticking out horizontally, positioned near its center, acting as arms. Very sharp arms. The whole thing pulsating with an unholy energy. Well, the metal is composed of bent and unnaturally. The abomination saw our team and it screeched in delight. The hunger, noticing its prey, it raised one of its 2 middle legs and rushed forwards, ends of its blades leaving a new scar on the floor. "Incoming!" Agnes shouted while running forwards. My heart nearly stopped at her reckless actions. "Intercept!" she ordered while advancing, the deadly blade bouncing out of the wall, circumventing the monster. Lone Mountain grunted as the beast's axe was blocked by her shield, and she retaliated with a spear. But only the sparks flew from the spearhead, hitting the monster, leaving no lasting damage. Earth armor. Peter didn't waste any time adding a buff to her frontliner. Lone Mountain was instantly covered in a layer of glittering bronze, indicating the effect. "I can't turn the earth into mud here," he yelled. "The rock is too sturdy, not to mention the dungeon's influence." I was not far behind him, chanting, sending my fire shield to form over the warrior's body. The abomination hissed as its attacks triggered the response, the flames dancing uselessly on its bloated frame. Seeing this, I hesitated. My spells allowed for great destruction, but in these cramped quarters it would end with collateral damage, and I wasn't a great fan of getting scolded by my fiancée. Thankfully, I wasn't alone. Eva Healer had another thing up her sleeve. "Cover your eyes," she shouted, garnering the monster's attention. "O light, come to my aid and blind my enemies. Gather upon my palm." Blinding flash. As her chant ended, her eyes were safely closed. All of us understood what she was doing. Not counting the monster, it screeching again. This time the pain with its small red eyes blasted with the light so promptly blinded. It had stopped it for a moment. It was long enough to get my powers ready. "Firebolts incoming! Make way!" I shouted, this time remembering to warn the surroundings about what was going to happen. Mother, gathering in my chest, was flowing forwards towards my left hand. I must do it like the teacher demonstrated. First, gather the mana, turn to the left and prepare to throw it like a javelin. My body automatically moved, curling up like a tense spring. Then prepare the right hand mana, pumping enough for the left hand to fire again. Acquire, target, and bounce. With an inner shout, I threw the firebolt gathered in my palm, letting its force of attack turn me around. In the time to gather another mana projectile. The twirl ended and I stopped, right hand at the ready. Boom! The firebolt impacted the enemy, and another was on its way. Soon the third one impacted the creature, all perfectly hitting the same spot. It screeched even louder than before, reading in pain. I was in the zone, my fire burned, brightly and more lively than ever. Power. It was the ultimate drug, until a shout woke me up. Undead are coming from behind. Eve screamed at her attunement in the light, clearly allowing her to sense these abominations. Agnes reacted immediately. Boulder got the back. Tina tried to help him. I almost forgot about our new rogue. She was hiding between the two frontliners, covering in the darkness. Well, nobody can blame her for considering how she was only a 4th level. They both nodded, and the girl prepared to do some throwing knives. Not very effective against the undead, but considering the space taken by Boulder, there wasn't much more that she could do. Rogues were known for their ranged weaponry. After their shots, their meaty parts and abomination bore clear signs of burns. The damage was being done. We needed to keep it up. Just as I was celebrating the victory, 2 groups of beings emerged from behind our backs. If not for Eve's warning, I would have classified them as golems. The black armor covered most of their humanoid bodies, leaving only parts of their head exposed. The malevolent light in their eyes, blighted with the skin, however, revealed their true nature: undead. The enemy of all living. Even the fallen tribes weren't able to secure peace with these creations of corruption. Armed with maces and shields, they were clearly a melee-class monster, moving in coordination groups and soundlessly charging towards Boulder and the girl. What happened afterwards I could only describe as ridiculous. The half-orc lifted a tower shield and turned it sideways. This was an acceptable solution, as it blocked the whole tunnel from the undead usually didn't know how to jump. Then he lifted a 2-handed mace and attacked horizontally with it. It was a few enemy vanguards were squished against the wall, with an audible crack. This side should be safe, I thought prematurely, except nobody thought that the undead armed with a freaking artifact would appear. It used the wind-up time from Boulder to attack the close gap and run forward, waving his weapon. Normally, I would have just laughed at it, but the mace it carried clearly was blessed by some kind of power. Within a second it landed and hit Boulder, grunted at the blue lightning, danced, and clearly dealt damage. Magic? He shouted while in pain. Don't move, I answered while turning back and pelting the creature with firebolts. Tina joined my assault as soon as he said and squirmed in place, only lifelessly fall to the ground a moment later. The rest of its companions still attacking, however, so the battle continued. Uno. I watched as the adventurers dispatched my minions and the decapitator. They were stronger than anyone who arrived in my dungeon. I should tread carefully, but they had so many mages, so many calls, so many things to experiment on. Something in me stirred, and I found myself using the same strategy as before, sending the mental abomination after them and then flanking it. It felt strangely comfortable to try repeating the earlier battle with the adventurers. This time, however, it didn't end as I expected. My forces were defeated, but at least I was able to hear an interesting exchange. Agnes, these are artifact weapons on the 1st floor, the redhead man shouted excitedly, while cradling the crackling mace close to his chest. The woman who spoke to a frown, trying to escape her healer's iron grip. Yes, and there were also a boss in the first room, you know. Ordinary people would get slaughtered by this combination. Oh, come on, it's clear that old Immortal Blade Master had a hidden cache, and that the dungeon had a taste of it. The smile on the man's face grew even wider. We need to send a message to the kingdom immediately. This place must be preserved. Only after we scout some more, I have a strange feeling like we're being watched. By who? Maybe you mean the rats from above. Maybe, Charles. Don't forget that the Lunars will probably preach their peace. Am I good now, Eve? She turned her attention to the elfin healer. Yes, Princess. The girl wearing white armor nodded, walking towards the slightly greenish man. He reminded me of a guy who burned so well. This was an informational conversation, so not everybody wants to kill me. Some only prefer enslavement. Oh joy. End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 32. These invaders seemed much stronger than the earlier batch. Their coordination, training, and overall competence level trumped the weak attempts of the sentients made before. If they continued their unimpeded advance into the first floors, would get conquered in no time. The only minion even remotely able to keep up with them was the Guardian, while the inhabitants of the other rooms would hardly pose a challenge. It was unacceptable, especially seeing how desired my crappling maces were. At the item that I classified as consumable, given not very bright undead, were being considered as a priceless relic. And yet, anything easily accessible was bound to get more and more mundane. I had to make them work for it. Wait, how did I go from killing them to making some kind of trial? Something was seriously wrong. My thoughts. Anyway, the level of desire the red-haired man displayed suggested that they were rare and powerful weapons on the surface. How? Was the knowledge of the human race not enough to craft such things? Impossible. I saw the magical necklace that he was wearing, but then most of his party were wearing only mundane weapons and armor. Hardy and all that, but not in the slightest bit enchanted. Only their leader, Agnes, was a small thief called Tina, were in possession of an artifact, as it was called by the Fire Mage, and that was supposedly a very powerful party, led by a member of royalty. Their inability to produce magic trinkets was even more unthinkable, considering that mages didn't seem to be that rare. At least, according to my perception, which true, may have been skewed because, as a dungeon, the percent of magically gifted guests was bound to be higher. Still, the ones using the mana during battle should be able to craft various items, right? Not that I was complaining. This deficit raised the possibility of snatching a few of them. After all, I had already mastered the field of autopsies. My artificial wire arms were able to process bodies in pretty much every single part of my domain, as long as there weren't any sentients nearby. Quite fast, too. Back to the present, though. The team delving into my dungeon had to be stopped right now, and I had just an idea of how to do it. I had to send my second floor creations up in order to bolster the number and strength of my current forces, but it was doable, especially since some of the new minions were especially interesting, like, for example, Libras of the exploding kind. Yep, I made the exploding undead, or Libra exploders, according to the system. They were even dumber than their brethren, but still intelligent enough to follow basic orders like run there and use the stick. The stick in question was a rod of the artifact capable of stunning the enemies and sometimes even spawning out lightning, which jumped from one foe to another. Not like these dumb undead were using it in this way. Nope, that was only the way for them to spark the fuse, since they were large sheets of energized volatile metal. This made them easily visible, with their blue sashes worn as the piece of clothing, reaching from their arms to the waist. While I was in the right mood for an electrified version of the basic abomination was also made. The system called them Electro-Touch Libras. They were also armed with electric sticks, but unlike the suicidal brothers, they were actually trained to their use. In the process of their creation, their bodies gained resistance to electricity, saving them from the fate of being struck by their own weapons. I still haven't tested them in real combat, but I had a really good feeling about their performance. Both of these creatures used a rather large amount of anima. In the beginning, I wasn't worried at all, thinking it would refill in time, and a limited amount did. The rest, however, disappeared, making me a bit more apprehensive about using it. While I could circumvent many problems with it, there was a feeling of unease and unexpected results when doing so. As such, I decided to mostly work with what I've got, reaching for this wondrous power only from necessity. Continuing this train of thought, I had converted 2 second-floor rooms into what I could only call a factory. As for the locals, it was similar to the manufacturing workshop, since most of the process was still being done by hand, not real machine. These were hands of the levers, though, and so the mechanical parts were debatable. The system even recognized my specially modified undead with elongated fingers and larger eyes, as a new species made especially for the type of work. Craft Libras they were called, an innately slow and careful race. I also didn't use any anima. Much. Anyway, the factory rooms my creations were gathering an energized metal into iron balls and fitting them with the end with nearly 2.5 meters of long wooden rods. And then this point of contact was a spark of feed for the small Devourer-made batteries. When the wielder of this weapon hit something, the spark would come to life, and the resulting explosion should take care of the enemies, showering them with iron shrapnel. There were also handheld versions of the mines being made. Of course, the former was a Libra exclusive that I had no need to actually waste my living minions in a suicidal charge. The latter worked because it's simply gravity, because of the sparker was used as a detonator. I was able to make timed bombs too, but these would need to be made by continuous use of anima. Like I earlier mentioned, I was not too fond of doing that right now. There was a pronounced sense of incongruity about it, especially after I went wild with using its powers on my second floor. Like there was something that I was forgetting. Anyways, in the manufacturing workshop, Whole rows of Libras were sitting down, the best for manual workers using their infinite concentration to craft more and more armaments. In the middle of the room I fitted a long belt kept in motion by another abomination. It was spinning the handle of the simple gear machine. It never tired, never grew bored, and undid the perfect labourer. The said room was deathly silent, with only the sound of clanking metal and the occasional movement of the abominations breaking the perfect stillness, and even more the occasional explosions. Sometimes the undead screwed up. The unstable materials fell onto the floor, or simply slipped through their fingers. That wasn't really a problem. The problem was that the amount of security I stuffed nearby. The fact that some of these guys were exploding Kite. Yep, Libra exploders. They saw the metal fall, and they tried to help, lifting it up, with the hand that held the electric stick in it. And then, boom! Let's just say that it was another layer of security. After all, only my undead managed to keep up with the amount of shrapnel and electricity constantly sailing through the room. I won't even start nagging about the room where I stuffed the already prepared Libra exploders. If an enemy walked it right in, shudder. It was still worth it, though. Some of the mentioned weapons were also distributed to my rattling minions. They were especially glad when the bombs and similar exploding devices made their way into the warrens, or rather down the tunnels that they dug. Since the day that the Queen begged me on all fours for a blessing of power, I lost any doubt to whether they were intelligent or not. I still couldn't understand their language, but a simple form of communication was possible. On my side, it consisted of various shapes made with wires, and on her, the different kinds of squeaks, pictures, and pointing. I was making amends, too, since I already managed to dissect a few of her subjects. Still, as a sole Mother Queen, she was less worried about her people's demise on my operating table than the perspective of sentients invading our lands. That is why I decided to agree to some of their propositions, the ones that I could understand, at least, and the less insane ones, of course. Because of that, I had now both Iron Flame Rat Temple warriors and Air Force capable of bombardment and boarding, as some kind of assassin rats, which were neither stealthy nor deadly, but they could be. And that was worth it for me for these few tons of metal and wood. Yep, the Iron Flame Rats grew to significant force in the small rattling empire, unlike the ones serving directly under the Queen and working in some kind of caste system. The Iron Flames were strictly a meritocracy, or maybe I should say a deathcracy. Was that even a word? The new law of the jungle was their only rule, and the rat who managed to wrest the crown from the late king's bloodied paws became the new ruler. This created a few new evolutions, like the leader was called the Flamecaller, who was pretty much 3 times bigger than the ordinary members of their species, not to mention some innate abilities and a lack of the word lesser in their species name. He also didn't really have any ability to evoke flame, being mostly a melee fighter, with an appearance of a gorilla-like rat with a very large sturdy-looking fists. Or how the guards defending the temple grounds acquired hardened hides and red, fiery eyes, with a species changed to demonic rat. Their snouts were hidden behind leather helmets, similar to the one the Roman legionnaires were wearing, only with a mohawk-like plume. And the flying ones? Oh, the flying ones. They managed to tame my average glass dragonflies, literally changing their species to tamed enlarged dragonfly. Only the smallest of the rattlings were able to ride them, though. Their method of attack was also limited to throwing rocks or diving strikes. Still, the sheer surprise that they brought, not to mention that their mounts had the ability to bite and claw their prey on their own. There was also one big rat that desperately tried to fly, but no matter how he tried, there simply wasn't a dragonfly big enough to carry him. He had a tendency to stare at the flying dragonflies with a clear desire in his eyes, with a puppy-like stare. It was both hilarious to me and sad. Maybe. No anima. Anyway, there were a few more rooms that I dug out already, and a few other projects, but was I forgetting something? Right, adventurers. I was going to watch their progress. Damn, they're already battling Jonathan. End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 33. Uno. Jonathan was my very first boss monster. He wore his dull, metallic armor with pride, slowly lumbering from the kitchen to the food hall, and, only sometimes, even into the sparring room. His large, wide frame usually seemed peaceful and casual if one discounted the wide maw full of death sitting in the middle of his face. As an ironhide undead, his zombie skin was cracked, but extremely durable, while the Dark Knight part of his origin made sure that he was adequately equipped with his metal leggings, gauntlets, and chest armor and helmet. He was an unliving tank, not armed with a weapon, but flaunting his endless hunger. Its maw was usually filled with rocks that I had modified to look like food. The lack of taste he exhibited was enough for my deception to work flawlessly, at least until something much tastier waltzed in. Like an adventuring team consisting of fresh and tasty humans, and even an elf. The Sword of Hope, as they called themselves, just managed to splatter the two Libras sparring in the earlier room, and the undead parts that scattered all around the place, something that I was unwilling to overlook. I had my little revenge as they froze when entering the food hall. Many suits of armor stood near the walls, guarding the large room with the long table situated in the middle, filling with empty plates and forks and spoons and knives. A few iron candlesticks were stuck in between them, and adding to the atmosphere. The rest of the place was filled with the polished stone tiles, and a few banners that I had replicated some time ago. Otherwise, the room would feel naked and they were before. After all, it was the rightful place. Not that I knew what they were representing. It seemed like the adventurers did, though, as they were staring at the replicated insignias hanging on the walls. There was a certain tension in the air, but it has been interrupted as soon as Jonathan walked into the room. Unlike most of my creations, he had a mouth, lungs, and enough individuality to use them. Seeing the 7 living people, he roared loudly, showing his teeth off and grabbing at the air with his armored hand. The adventurers reacted quickly, readying their weapons and getting into formation. The melee warriors with the shields took to the front, lightly armored fighters waited behind them, and the mages prepared their spells in the back. A classic tactic, at least according to my gaming days. The next course of actions that Donovan decided was weird, however. He retreated into the kitchen. The leader of the party, Princess Agnes, motioned the half-orc warrior to check it out, but the small rogue Tina only shook her head. "I'll go," she spoke while readying her daggers. The undead was the type that aren't unusually that bright, so I should be. The rest of her speech had been interrupted as Jonathan emerged again, roaring his challenge to the world. This time he had an unwieldy, crudely made mace with a lump of iron at the end. It looked barely functional, but heavy enough to do some damage. On the other hand, he was wielding a portion of the meat with a large bone sticking out the one side. He was holding it with his bed bone, creating both a courageous and funny impression. The food was of course made of stone, yet the illusion crumbled as soon as he chewed on the freshly looking aside. Small piece of stone ran between his teeth and into the ground. "Do you see what I saw?" Boulder roared in laughter, pointing at his weapon at the opponent. "Is it eating stone? I knew that undead were dumb, but this—" "Shut it," commanded Agnes, her weapons and eyes not leaving the monster for a moment. "Keep watch. This thing is no pushover, and I don't like how these armors are looking. Charles, please blast a few of them, just in case." The redhead mage nodded and started to leisurely cast a spell. This time he wasn't shooting magic outright. Interesting. Now, I could leave the Libras be, further reinforcing the invaders' belief that these were the only decorative armors, and some of them were, but I highly doubted that the mage would only hit the fakes, or that the Libras cooked by the flames would refrain from attacking the politely fall to the floor. Thus, as soon as his chant ended and he threw the missile towards my minions, I ordered them to step down from their little pedestals that they walked down in unison, preparing their weapons like square shields. And the redhead mage cursed loudly, and I did too. As he aimed at one of the replicas, well, the next one would surely hit another Libra. I consoled myself while looking over the battlefield. The flank of the adventurous team was exposed, and my undead was rushing forward to exploit this weakness, while Jonathan advanced forward with his slow gait, still eating and swinging his enormous mace in a dangerous fashion. "Oh, Bella's golden tits," Agnes cursed as she directed her team. "Boulder, stop the big guy. Lone Mountain and Tina break down the undead. Charles, help them." The trio nodded and formed another front, focusing the battle on my Libras. Eve, make sure that you're supporting Boulder with all you've got. Peter, try to stop him. Something large like the tremor should give us an advantage. Seeing the pale man nodding, she smiled, showing her teeth. Now her figure looked like a predator, ready to pounce. I'll circle around and try to distract the abomination. The princess shouted while running ahead and dodging Jonathan's mace by centimeters. Peter followed, his ghostly figure soon disappearing. The two remaining fighters looked at each other awkwardly. Boulder smiled shyly. It was a very strange smile. Let's get along, he spoke in a hopeful tone. Just move it. You're not better than these monsters, slave. Eve pouted while shooing him forward with a displeased expression. The half-orc only sighed and marched ahead, keeping his shield up. The first attack from Jonathan forced the air out of his lungs, but miraculously he managed to stop only after getting pushed about 30 centimeters. A large dent was, however, visible in the middle of his tower shield. "What the hell?" he shouted in exasperation. "This here is a pure metal shield. How strong is this bastard?" "Look out!" Eve shouted as another swing arrived near him. This time, Boulder wasn't able to stop it completely, and the strength of the attack lifted him up by a few centimeters and then threw his clanking figure towards the back. He bounced a few times before stopping. "Hey-ya!" Agnes shouted, with her wild swings cut into the Ironhide's weak spots. Yet these were only small wounds, and the abomination could still fight without problems. On the second battlefield, Lone Mountain, Tina, and Charles were tearing my Libras apart. Somehow they developed much better coordination than their undead opponents, who I trained day and night. Was that the difference in levels, or maybe innate talent? Lone Mountain was like a defensive shield from which Under Tina attacked with a terrifying precision. It was hard to believe that she was only a level 4. The decisive strikes she doled out weren't able to outright kill my monsters, but they blinded, hobbled, and otherwise made them useless. Stationary targets were just right enough for some roasting. As a fire mage, Charles was happily burning down my forces on any occasion. He already blessed Lone Mountain armor and with the counter-attack ability, which wasn't that useful against the undead, but still distracted them with pretty colors. Only a few of my Libras remained, most of them in pretty bad shape. It was time to act. Once the Libras were dealt with, these 3 invaders would turn their blades against Jonathan, and Nec Hercules contra Plurus, the singular champion, would fall under the combined blades. Especially since, just now, I remembered that they had one more party member, the Earth Mage called Peter. Where did he disappear to? My magical eye cameras spotted him at the edge of the battlefield, mumbling chants. Damn it, he was just far enough away from my minions. Shaking my invisible head, I called on reinforcements. The Rattlings. Yes, they were small and weak, and yes, for some reason the Rattling Queen refused to send stronger and better-trained rats to the first floor. But it doesn't matter how big your forces are, it matters how you use them, the technique, and that's how you become a king on the battlefield. And in bed, or something like that. With my mental nudge, about 20 Rattlings emerged from their hidden tunnels, armed with spear throws and squeaking wildly. I asked the Queen many times to teach them restraint, as a surprise attack was bound to succeed when executed in silence. To no avail. She showed me a few pictures of youth and such things, while presenting a few ninja-like rats born from the second level. There was even one who nearly couldn't perceive. But I digress. They ran forward with a loud roar, half of them stopping in the middle of the road to unleash their spear throws, and the rest keen on tasting the blood of the invaders in melee. Their target was clear. The party's healer. As for now, she had shown more or less the useful curing abilities. Additionally, both the outfit that she wore, a white dress, and her disdain for the lesser beings, and thus the distance she preferred to keep, made her a perfect victim for the concentrated attack. After all, I knew my games. Killing the healer was bound to cut their exploration short. Somehow I doubted the potions were a common thing in the world, when even the weakest magical items were so desperately desired. So yeah, after a second a barrage of 10 spears flew towards the elf Eve. She had only enough time to widen her eyes and start screaming in terror when a shadow of death arrived, and was swatted down by the very armored and very sweaty orc, well, half-orc. Boulder did what any decent tank should do. He literally put himself in harm's way. That was normal. What wasn't normal was his ability to jump so far while wearing that 50 kilogram of metal. He soon fell on the side, grunting heavily, and cursed under the heaven, only to clamber back up to look at his companion, most of the spears helplessly lying on the ground. Most. Besides one. The elf had a metal shaft piercing her left arm, making her fall limply to the side. The blood stained her once white dress. Contrary to my expectations, Eve wasn't crying or screaming. No. Her face turned into a near-demon mask, bristling with fury. Just as I was thinking with disdain, what could a healer even do? Even if she rages, I heard the answer to my question. I would prefer that I didn't. She rose quickly, weakened and barely standing straight, but with her green, large eyes full of fury, and then she started her chant. I call upon you, oh, the brightest spear, find and skewer my enemy, ravage their bodies with the endless fury, riddle them with holes. I call upon you, the brightest spear, become my weapon, fall upon that all is alive, mark it with your hottest flame. I call upon you, O brightest spear, a child of the bright fury, a one of your own. With the chant ending in a globe of light appearing above her head, shining brightly, a large amount of small, stick-like extensions cropping out of its surface, I noticed that every single one of them pointing towards my creatures, and shouted in panic, "Take cover!" They, however, just stood there, paralyzed by something. "Go!" The cold voice echoed in the room, and the laser-like projectile shot out, piercing the heads of my minions, killing them in one hit. Their wounds were instantly cauterized, stopping the blood flow. My cameras were also destroyed, so I was forced to remain in my material form. All was ravaged, but not good old Jonathan. He somehow managed to get away from only half of his face blown away. That said, the atmosphere of the room changed. Most to Eve with the unmistakable "oh crap" expression that I always supported in the past. Good. I mean, bad times. Anyways, shaking her head, Princess Agnes addressed the invaders. Focus on the job, we still have a big bad to get off. She then turned her own glare towards the healer. And I will talk to you later, Eve. Her expression for the moment changed to a near cry. You promised, quickly nodding to the elf girl retreated, not before the last harsh words caught up to her. And for Bella's sweet house, heal yourself, woman. Eve ran back, escorted by Boulder. The battle continued. End of chapter. Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 34. Uno. Jonathan's roar echoed against the walls of the food hall, his endless fury and pain soaking into the stone for a moment that he felt like an eternity. He and his opponent stood petrified, similar to the biblical painting of Goliath and David I once saw. Well, David's in this case. If, of course, Goliath was a large, armored undead with half of his face blown off, and there were many Davids skulking around, armed not with a simple leather sling, but deadly weapons. So, it was nothing like the biblical painting in the end. Yet somehow I couldn't get the scene out of my head. Maybe because I was thoroughly impressed that Jonathan managed to block the entrance to the lower levels without any orders. It was not a small feat in my book. Since the pain must have been monstrous, his eyes simply disappeared as the magic disintegrated the upper left part of his skull, leaving cauterized and burned tissue. It looked nasty, and I was wondering how did he even survive such an attack. But I guess being undead has helped. Or maybe it was just a stone diet. Who knows? Anyway, he was blocking the way forward with his own body nonetheless. He had bought me a few minutes to move my troops, arm them, and overall prepare, to make sure that the real trap on the second floor was ready to be sprung. I knew I could do it, after all. Even now I nearly succeeded. If only my servants were a bit stronger. My traps were a bit more elaborate. Wait, why didn't I do it then? I could send more minions, better build traps, so why? This feeling, this déjà vu. It came and disappeared immediately, and just when I thought I understood, the reality struck me. Jonathan was standing near the exit, not because its body retained some misguided notion of chivalry, but because of the sudden loss of vision, or rather the lack of depth perception that was common when one had only a single eye to depend on. This idea was further reinforced by the swing which crashed unwieldy weapon against the ground. It landed with a powerful noise, expelling the pieces of stone all around it, except that it completely missed the target, a petrified rogue. She still ate a fistful of gravel, so it wasn't all that bad. I had to laugh. My chuckle lasted for only a moment, though. The adventurer, leader, Princess Agnes, showed no sudden expression and understanding, seeing that the abomination repeated its violent behavior and gouging out a few more holes in the ground. This, in turn, made me grind my teeth in anger. Yeah, sure, you came to my place, made a mess and tried to steal my trenches, and now you're not hiding that you caught on how to kill my monster. I knew it was an irrational feeling. I knew that the dungeon calls were treated as soulless beasts. They were soulless beasts. I was different, however. As an intelligent being, there was always a hard limit on how much stuff I was able to swallow, and because of that, I wanted to scream out my rage to the world. Even more so because the people who were in the source of this hatred were right there, in my dungeon, trampling on all that I had built. I was considering drastic measures. I was seriously considering... What was I thinking? I don't remember. This time he learned from his earlier failures. He swung his weapon horizontally, forcing the advancing warriors to hurriedly get out the way. I inwardly nodded. If he had kept fighting this way, being one-eyed didn't matter. As an undead, he had unlimited stamina, although I was a bit worried about his now missing left part of his face. Who knows if there was some lasting or ticking damage. Like I said before, the skin and bone looked burned, but they also cauterized, just like a wound that a real laser would make. Still, considering that it seemed really slow when comparing it to the real thing, I was hesitant to call it a laser. The light magic ought to be nearly instantaneous from the human point of view. Why was I able to notice it and warn the others? Once again, the magic of this world stumped me. My boss monster warded off the enemies once again, but this time I saw the glint in the princess's eyes. She had a plan. Yikes. At least she was down to the Charles and the Fire Mage, tall warrior Lone Mountain and skittery thief Tina and herself. The elf and the half-orc warrior Boulder was sitting on the ground, slowly pulling out the projectiles from her body. Wait, wasn't there one more guy present? Where did he go? Peter, have you finished the incantation? She shouted at the air, and suddenly a man's presence appeared in my inner radar. Yes, my cameras were destroyed in the fighting, but he shouldn't be able to avoid my senses anyway. And yet, he did. Yes, Princess, it's a big target, though. I may be able to stop it for a minute, at most. He shouted back, and his shrouded figure poked out from the pieces of armors scattered around the room. Also, we have outsiders in the party. His prickly stare focused on Tina. No time, do it. The man in question sighed, receiving a direct order, and released his mana. A whisper-like shadow flew through the air towards Jonathan's position. The big oaf didn't even notice it and curled near his feet. I wanted to scream to warn him. It was too late, however. Steel Shadow. The mage chanted, and suddenly my knight had found himself stopped in the middle of a swing. He looked like a golfer preparing for a wide shot. I would laugh if the odds weren't so stacked against me. Immobilization magic. Really? Charge! Agnes didn't waste time as she sprung into action like a human-shaped blade. Just behind her, Lone Mountain charged ahead, while making full use of her spear. Her hits were focused on the gaps between Jonathan's black armor. Tina was not far behind, her daggers also searching for weak points. Jonathan's body trembling with each hit, and I could see that his seething rage was desperately trying to get free. Something that Peter noticed immediately. I can't keep it still for 20 seconds at longest, he screamed, visibly clutching his hand. Get back! The redhead Charles already finished his spell, and a large ball of fire floating above his man's head. Greater fireball. He screamed at the top of his lungs while shoving the majestic sphere forwards. It flew deceptively slowly towards the abomination, and after a few seconds it arrived at Jonathan's face. He stopped struggling, seeing the unavoidable demise closing in. The powerful spell roasted his upper body, turning it into ash. A loud explosion echoed in the room, throwing the still living people against the walls. It was a perfect opportunity to attack. However, my forces on this floor were already done. I could do no more. I couldn't. Why? There was this feeling, like trying to find out with your tongue where a missing tooth was, like something was supposed to be there. This feeling, what was I talking about? Ah, right, adventurers. After the explosion, they slowly stood, flicking the dust and grime from their clothes. Some were talking, others focused on looting. Remember, I'm an Earth Mage, understood? Peter was standing above Tina, who dutifully tried to find out if my monster had any additional items in their pockets. Too bad, no gold, no potions for you. Yes, I understand. Nobody will know. She nodded seriously while not stopping for a moment. Good. Peter suddenly lowered his head and whispered into her ears. And nobody will know who you are, little hawk. His smile looked a bit cruel. For the first time, Tina raised her head. A trace of shock was visible in her eyes. How did you... We all have secrets, huh? He summoned a strange smoky shadow to curl around the thief's legs. And I'm sure you have quite a large amount of information I could borrow, huh? The girl only shook her head. I won't tell you a thing. Do your worst. Her figure radiated determination. Tch. And here I thought that the kingdom sent a weak hunting bird. Oh well, it still works for me. A wide smile suddenly appeared on his face. I don't care about your mission, be it what it may. Just remember to never cross me, little birdie. After saying the lines of the Earth Shadow Mage left the rogue alone. Bastard, Tina whispered under her breath, still continuing to gather useful materials. Balder and Eve were sitting a few meters back, and the man using his large hands to keep the blood from flowing to a minimum. A human-shaped tourniquet. The elf was clenching her teeth and slowly pulled out the spear. She had to stop from moment to moment, nearly fainting from the constant pain and exhaustion. Then, with a delicate "ah" scream, she pushed out the last piece of metal. A large sigh escaped her small lips. At least it wasn't poisoned, commented Balder. She didn't answer in words directly, focusing on magic. Soon the wound started to close under the brilliant light of her healing spell. Eat. He continued, undaunted with her reaction. The magic may heal your wound, but the blood you lost won't regenerate so easily. The half-orc looked at the piece of bread and then cheese from his backpack lying nearby. Eat. How do you know this? Eve reached out the food and started to nibble on the pieces, while her green eyes were the first time deigned to really look at her companion. Surviving in the slums is not all about muscles, or in the army, or in the gladiator pits. He laughed sadly. But they help. A look like a well-oiled machine, his pectoral muscles started to move up and down. While the elf ignored him, I laughed for a bit. I remember correctly, some of the bodybuilders from my world could do that also. I see. The girl returned to her meal, but the atmosphere around them changed for the better, and was immediately shattered by a loud shout from Charles. Ho crap! He screamed his lungs out. Come here, people, right now. The adventuring party scrambled towards the room I grandly named the kitchen. Even if there were only inedible rocks in there, Subi. For Jonathan, that was so much as enough. The loudmouth mage was standing near my oven, playing with the knobs and watching the fire rise and fall. The rest of the party looked on with their mouths hanging open. I couldn't understand what was so strange about the device. The silence in the room didn't help. That was until Agnes spoke with a slightly trembling voice. No magic power. None. Charles shook his head in denial and whistled loudly. Bella tits. This is just so much more complicated. What? Why? The party thief was out of the loop, just like me. Technology. No magic. This means Peter closed his eyes in wonder. Either the first or second Empire relic site. And this dungeon, his greedy stare licked my walls. This dungeon devoured it all, and it can replicate these items. A forgotten dungeon, then? Asked Balder with a deep voice. Yep. And they're near Luna and Gaynor Kingdom borders. This will get ugly. You mean that was why we didn't find any clue about the Luna expedition team? We need to go back, Charles shouted, suddenly panicked. Our defenses aren't prepared for an all-out assault from these green-thumbed lunatics. No. The short and decisive voice came from the princess. Her eyes were bright and full of conviction. Not until we conquer the first floor. There should be a few more rooms, 4, maybe 5 at most. There is usually only a limited amount of them on the first floor. Peter agreed, and sporting a greedy expression. And the first group that defeats the first floor guardian gets a special prize, Agnes spoke with a smile. Considering that this is a forgotten dungeon. The rest of the team nodded, even Charles seemed to somehow convinced. But I didn't prepare a prize. End of chapter. The Forgotten Dungeon, Chapter 35. Uno. The human adventurers were busy. Their greed prompted them to advance recklessly, but my holes were anything but easy. especially since the rogue seemed to be much weaker than her Elven Ranger counterparts, at least in the traps department. Maybe it was a difference in experience, or maybe she had just had a class less focus on detection and more on hiding or killing. Who knows? No matter how much they wanted to rush through like a human-shaped rhinos, it was just impossible. The spear traps and pitfalls in this part of the dungeon were paced irregularly, and, most importantly, manned by rattlings that made sure that the ignorant invader would end up looking like a pincushion, preferably laying at the bottom of a deadfall too. Well, the hallway wasn't that long. They were moving step by step right now. I could still recall their expressions when the spear trap nearly took out the red-haired mage, who insisted on keeping a faster pace. So close. Their abilities allowed the adventurers to dodge some of the attacks or even move quickly from one place to another, but I noticed a suspicious lack of defensive or utility skills. Making use of this weakness was a line of thought worth of pursuing. No matter how strong the people in the Swords of Hope seemed to be, there was a clear preference for dealing more damage. It was just like they were not the adventurers, but soldiers used to assault. In my head, they were more like explorers and daredevils, not these down-to-earth individuals. Only the half-orc warrior seemed different. A few of his skills made him a prime defense specialist of the group. There were also a lone mountain girl, but she was much more dodge-focused than the man called Boulder. Still, considering the low quality of his equipment and the fact and the buffs only reinforced his body and did not much more. But I was sure the outcome of his was forced into one of the bouts with my guardian. Then again, one was a sentient and another was an amalgamation of machines and undead monsters. The guardian was also the boss of the first level. Not to mention, the adventurers would never allow for such a duel to take place. Yeah, maybe this comparison wasn't the best. Anyway, my point was that these adventurers were, instead of focusing on survivability, tended to prioritize their attack power and powerful skills. Or maybe it was just me classifying them as squishy meatbags. Most of my minions, after all, were heavily armored, undead, or made from metal. Back to the point. Such focus made them easy to exploit with indirect means of attack, like poison, hallucinogens, and acid. Too much I wasn't well versed in the stuff. The TV shows and books that I'd read didn't delve into the subjects. I had plants that were pretty potent poison on the second level, but making an airborne toxin was just too much. Maybe if I used animal magic as the way to power them up. There was no need though, as I had another way to mess with the invaders. For one, I had the power of explosions. The amount of Libra exploders on the second floor had already reached a critical mass. I wasn't sure how many of them exploding at once would cave in the tunnels, so I had to be delicate. 10 of the blue-sashed bastards were waiting in the entrance of the central pond. Why not directly under the stairs? The room was too small to hide them all. I could, of course, resize them, but why bother? The central room had a lot of flora and fauna floating about, putting a few of the Libra exploders around the rock, the trees, the walls, and unnoticed much easier. Was attacking the adventurers as soon as they arrived on my second floor cowardly? Maybe. My survival was at stake, though, and the kiddies' gloves were off. By the way, since the adventurers were progressing through the aptly named trapped hallway at a really slow pace, I retreated to the second floor in order to gather my thoughts. There was something strange going on, something that I couldn't put my finger on. The invisible pressure I was feeling when my consciousness floated on the floor closer to the surface made some weak down here. I still had no idea what I really did. I just had a bad feeling floating inside my head. Wasn't much that I could do to confirm it, though. There was simply not enough information. Thus, the mental equivalent of a shrug, I returned to planning. Like I was wondering before, sentients seemed to have their abilities skewed in the direction of offense. I hardly saw any buffs or utility skills, not taking into account the hiding abilities of the rogue and the shadow mage. They were of course shields for both the fire mage and the earth mage bestowed onto their companions. The problem was that they seemed lackluster at best. There was also the thing about how they used these magics. It felt rigid and unnatural. This meant that they probably couldn't use them freely. Most, if not all of their spells were activated by pumping mana into the crystal located in their chest. After a chant, or sometimes even without it, the results would appear. Each time precisely the same, like it was created by a machine, not a human. Things like starting fires by manipulating mana or warming up the group seemed out of the question. More so, I decided to conclude that utility abilities like making walls of earth or fire magic, building a shelter with earth. I seem to remember that one of the mages shouted something about my influence messing things up, getting water by use of magic, and dispersing the smoke or poison with air magic were alien to them. I could enumerate even more applications. The point was that they weren't using their magic this way, at least not while I was looking. And this was probably the way forward, and I'll look into getting a temperature higher or lower, and the fiery rattlings being a natural solution. I needed a place to experiment. The second level was already done, but what about the third one? My dungeon core level was still only 1, and the feeling of fullness had been before didn't appear, which meant that I could only wait for the adventurers to come, and then kill them. I should probably revisit my traps and the monsters on the first floor. While it was true that I wasn't able to do anything to sentients walking about, even in the rooms that they already left, I still should reevaluate them and maybe even send some second floor monsters to help. So, let's go. Why am I on the second floor again? Did I finish working on the traps? Nope. They still seem to look the same. Weird. A mental experiment then. I'll move to the first floor, the kitchen room. Good. Now let's make... Where was I going again? The second floor core room. There was a nagging feeling bouncing around my head. I had to do something. What was it? A trap. The adventurers were about to reach the forge room when I understood that something was wrong. All it took was writing it down and what I wanted to do on the stone slab in my core room, and tens of tries. After who knows how many returns, I understood something was actively stopping me from modifying my first floor. A similar feeling, albeit much weaker, was present on the second level too. This made me angry. Was that the control of the gods, or maybe the twin Gangria that made me a slave? Wait. Focus, Luno. While both Mirabella and Brighton remain a suspect, Gangria herself should be out of the picture. At least as long as she didn't lie straight to my face, since her goal is killing the sentients limiting my abilities wouldn't make sense. Or she could just be a two-faced bitch. Or I could be the ritual of Daniel is describing to me some time ago, the one used on the dungeons in order to bind them. The details were vague at best, but still, if I compared the effects, the rooms and tunnels in my dungeon were under constant surveillance. No weird voodoo magic detected there. That left only the surface, and I had to move quickly and some of my forces out there to get a bearing of my surroundings, maybe even listen to some conversations. Another point for my bucket list. Right now I had a patient observer of the Swords of Hope's progress. They were currently in the forge room, where I had left the useless bile brain column. It was all diligently trying to create a blade, failing to do so, throwing it away into the waste barrel and taking another piece of metal out to shape it. It was stupid, but stubborn. Not that it mattered much. The humans were scouting the place, and Tina at the helm, but little did they know that the golem was too absorbed in his task to pay them any attention. Now, if you were to stop him from doing his work, that would be a different situation altogether. Seeing the rogue, obscured figure, I waited with anticipation. She crawled along the ground, slowly getting closer to the golem. After a few minutes of staring at the repeated task that the giant was busy with, she did something weird. She left the shadows. The tension didn't leave her shoulders and she trembled, eyeing each move of the golem. It, of course, ignored her, but this didn't make any tension less. The breaking moment was when she stood in his way, like a human-shaped obstacle, and he, after a short stare, was walked around her. It was then that Tina relaxed. Her face lost the sharp glare that she was sporting all the time. After observing the golem for a few minutes and confirming his further lack of reaction, she exhaled. A small murmur had left her lips, unheard by most, but not by me. You're doing your best too, right? Without turning back or waiting for an answer, she left the forge room. A few minutes later, Agnes lifted her brow questioningly, seeing the rogue returning without her defensive skills active. Is the room empty, Tina? She asked. No, not really. However, the monster there seems to be a utility kind. It didn't attack even when I appeared just before it. The group's thief wiped out her sweat and answered in a flat tone. Oh, I see. And what is it doing? Forging, I think, but it's not very good at it. A smile appeared on Tina's face. Forging, you say? Interrupted Charles, the redhead once again an eyesore. Can we take a look? What metal is it using? What is it forging? Maybe there'll be artifacts to acquire. His face twisted into a greedy expression at the end of the sentence. I doubt it, sir, Tina answered directly, but that didn't stop the man in the slightest. Let's go, let's go. Charles motioned to the party, only to be shoved back. What gives? He snapped with anger. Please get behind me, sir, Boulder said impersonally. While the monster didn't react to Tina's presence, we can't be sure that it would be the same when we all come, or if a mage appears in the vicinity. Charles retreated, but not without a look of full hatred. Don't do that again, slave. He hissed, only loud enough for the two of them to hear it. I won't, sir. He's right, you know, Eve suddenly interrupted, the whole team staring back at her in shock. What? She looked around in panic. It's rare for you to enter our discussion, Eve, that's all. Stifling her laugh, Agnes answered, the bewildered elf. Oh yes, you're right. The haughty expression left her face for a moment. Only the young lady was left, even if she was more than 100 years old, according to the party whispers. You were saying? Yes. Oh, right. There were records of monsters who were collecting the cores as we carried in our chests. I strained my attention. At least something interesting. It would be interesting to acquire such a monster, or even create one. They were using them to empower their bodies or forge artifacts and conduct it with magic power. Similarly to how the fallen tribes turn our mages into wands and staves, asked Charles with a face full of fury. Yes. However, the monsters have a more natural way of doing so. They simply devour the body and the core of the mage, thus gaining some of their affinity, she said with a weak smile. After a moment of silence, Agnes ordered, Mages in the back, warriors in the front. Let's keep the formation, people. She turned towards the redhead man. And no touching the loot until we confirm it's safe. Understood? Understood, the whole team replied, preparing their weapons. End of chapter. And that concludes today's episode of The Forgotten Dungeon. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so, all of which are listed below. But the easiest way would be to collect forgotten souls, create new dungeons, and force them to like and subscribe my videos. Alright, I hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next video.